Hey, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Hanging On to Hope podcast.
I'm Brenda J.
And I'm Karen Wonder.
And we are hangingontohope.org.
This podcast is intended as educational and is not psychological or medical advice. Always consult a professional when needed, and we disclaim any liability in connection with the instruction, information, or advice given.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hanging On to Hope podcast. This is Brenda J. Today, we are interviewing Gretchen Baskerville, author of The Life-Saving Divorce. Gretchen has been a divorce recovery leader in churches for 20 years, and this book is based on those experiences and interviews. We believe it is important to bring Gretchen to the show to help educate us on this topic of identifying and defining whether you're in a destructive marriage, if, when, and how to get out, and to give us hope and healing afterwards. So Gretchen, welcome to the show.
Wow, thank you so much. It's great to be with you two.
Hi, Gretchen. I'm ready to introduce myself, but this is Karen.
Hi, Karen.
Hi. So in chapter 1, you talk about what a life-saving divorce is, and you say, for more than 2 decades, I've been working with Christians going through divorce. Tears stream down their faces as they talk about how hard they tried to make their marriage work, how much they prayed, and how many times they went to counseling. These people are not quitters.
No,
they're
not.
Committed Christians who believe in the sanctity of marriage and take the Bible and marriage seriously. I can vouch for that. They knew there would be challenges, hard work, and compromise when they married, and they gave it their all. They forgave over and over, went the extra mile repeatedly, trying to be more forgiving, more agreeable, more loving. Brenda and I can totally relate to this, as she tried for 22 years and myself about 21 years.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. You say that half of divorces are life-saving. Can you explain to our listeners what types of serious problems in a marriage would define and likely require life-saving divorce? And I can kind of do an overview.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So the overview of them is chronic emotional or mental abuse, physical or sexual abuse, addictions, sexual immorality or infidelity, betrayal, criminal activity, incest, financial abuse, spiritual abuse, and neglect or abandonment. Mm-hmm. So if you want to expound on those.
Yeah, what's really interesting, and we just went through that list, and I never remember our churches telling us that a lot of divorces were for life-saving reasons. I remember hearing that something like the vast majority, maybe 95%, were due to frivolous reasons, Hollywood, lack of family values kinds of things. And that maybe a tiny handful of divorces really needed to take place, just to keep a wife and children from being battered or things like that. But those were just so minimal that there have been many, many studies on reasons for divorce, where these are anonymous studies, they're large studies, and they ask people, tell us why you got divorced. I found every single survey I could find on reasons for divorce, big surveys done by real researchers, peer-reviewed. By the way, they don't divide them out by life-saving divorces or non-life-saving. I was just looking at what I would call like hard reasons for divorce versus soft reasons or, serious reasons. When we're talking life-saving divorces, we're not talking about an I'm bored divorce or I feel unfulfilled divorce or, man, I just really miss the party life divorce or I'm just disappointed that my spouse isn't better looking or doesn't make more money divorce. Mm-hmm. Those are not the life-saving divorces. And it turns out that when you look at these studies, so one study I looked at, it indicated about 42% of divorces were for life-saving reasons. But the other 3, one was about 50%, one was 56%, and one was 59%. Well, that tells me that about half of U.S. divorces are for really miserable, horrible things like a pattern of sexual immorality, domestic violence, physical violence, chronic emotional abuse, life-altering addictions, someone who gambles away all the rent and grocery money, neglect, severe indifference, and then actual disappearance like abandonment. So there's a lot more than we were ever taught in our churches or by our Christian marriage authors or by, our Christian radio programs.
Yeah.
We gave kind of a laundry list, but there's a big difference between a divorce due to circumstances and a divorce due to someone's character issues. There are some divorces, about half of divorces are for circumstantial things. The I'm bored, the I'm disappointed, maybe I just shouldn't have married this early because I'm really not done partying and things like that. But, a lot of divorces are for external things, circumstantial things like illness and job loss and plant closure and, just the pressure that came from like a car accident or maybe an injury that's so bad that it debilitated a person or meddling in-laws. Okay. Those are, I genuinely have compassion for people who go through those things, but I don't put those in the class of the life-saving divorces unless, they're really, really severe. It's these character issues when you've got a spouse who has got really what researchers call antisocial behaviors and attitudes. They're extremely aggressive. They like to fight. They have many fights in their life. They're very irritable. They are impulsive. They're reckless. They have a reckless disregard for safety of themselves or others. I hear a lot of stories about, I was sick, I was in pain, I was going into labor. My husband stepped over me, walked out the door and went to go golfing. Mm-hmm. There's just sort of a reckless disregard for the safety or the pain or the danger that others are in. So when you look at somebody who's consistently irresponsible, like squandering the rent and grocery money, or they have a complete lack of remorse, they have no conscience. What we used to say at church, that their conscience is seared. They hurt you and they don't really care. They kind of feel entitled to hurt you. Those are the character issues behind a life-saving divorce.
Yeah, that's good to clarify.
Yeah. In chapter 2, you explain that examples of marriage difficulties were very minor in your premarital counseling books. Yes. Infidelity appeared only once, and you ask why the author doesn't say more words like intimidation, domination, and control, which are all serious red flags for domestic violence. And mine had all of those. Mm. Words like adultery, lying, cheating, betrayal, gambling, pornography, and addiction did not appear in the workbook at all. Abuse, slap, hit, push, or fight did not appear either. Also never brought up risky behavior such as abuse, adultery, prostitution, chronic lying, drug addiction, gambling, battering, or child sex abuse. The workbook assumed every Christian was a person of goodwill who had their spouse's best interest at heart. You are shocked and knew the Bible warns us of these predators. Can you give us some examples of scriptures of what the Bible says about these predators and what the Bible says about divorce as you talk about in chapter 6?
Okay. Wow. That's a huge topic.
Yeah.
So we could probably, do a whole hour just on this. But I won't do that. So, but yeah, let me just touch on what you started with. You brought up this Christian premarital workbook that I went through 35 years ago, at the recommendation of my church, because they wanted us to go through premarital counseling before they would perform the wedding. So I gladly went through this premarital workbook with my now ex-husband, who was involved with illegal and immoral sexual immorality, sexual behavior. You know how you have boxes of stuff when you move? I found the workbook like about 10 years ago. And I said, I've got to look at this workbook. How is it that I married this man? How is it? We went through this big, long, like 100-page workbook or whatever it was. And I looked at our answers and they were all honest. And I thought, wait a second, how could this possibly be that we were honest in this book and no red flags came up? There were no warnings about whether you should call off the marriage or maybe postpone the engagement or maybe pray more about it and think maybe this isn't the right person for you. No major issues ever were brought up. in this Christian premarital workbook. And I think it's probably the best-selling one on the market. It's called Before You Say I Do by H. Norman Wright.
Wow, we did that one too.
Did you?
Yes. I was just thinking that when you were saying that. I'm like, is that the same one?
Yes. Okay. So and I know that book just assumed that if you were two Christians, well, let's just push forward to marriage. Didn't ever bring up. Now, probably back then, 35 years ago, they didn't use the word red flag, but they certainly could have talked about aggression, lying, deceit, those kinds of things. Why didn't any of those things come up? Why didn't violence come up? I mean, none of those things are brought up and said, this is sin, this is dangerous, and if this happens, you're going to wish you hadn't married this person. Mm-hmm. But it didn't. It was every comment. There was one mention of dominance, and it said, this probably isn't the right attitude in a Christian marriage. I think it should say, bang the drums. Right. Tell your pastor right now, this is not going to go away. No. This is a serious problem. This is going to destroy your life.
I would have liked to have that checklist, and then I would have definitely.
I know. That's why I actually put into my book 130 examples of abuse, because we do need checklists like that. Anyway, so you asked me about Bible verses.
Yes.
There are 5 what I consider to be the key Bible verses. People don't realize that mistreatment of wives, let's be fair, some women are pretty vicious and malicious, and sometimes men are victims of abuse or betrayal. But since I'm speaking, I think, primarily to a woman's audience, I'm going to use women as being my victims here. But just know that I did interview men in my book. I have a whole chapter on male victims of abuse and betrayal, and I do a lot of YouTube videos, interviews with them. But there are 2 really fascinating passages in the Old Testament where you kind of wonder, why did God give this law? But 2 passages are about laws about how you have to treat low status wives. Okay, so what would be a low status wife back in ancient Israel, 3,500 years ago? Why did Moses feel it necessary to give laws that would protect these low status wives? Well, one of them is in Exodus 21, 10 through 11. And I'll read the scripture to you, and then I will tell you something that most Christians don't know. And that is that this biblical passage is the cornerstone of all Jewish marriage and divorce law. So we Christians kind of ignore this because it's an Old Testament passage, and we've never been taught that it was important. But the Jewish community absolutely sees this as their cornerstone passage on marriage and divorce. Okay, it's Exodus 21, 10 through 11, and it's talking about a man who has got a wife already, and she's a low status wife. She was probably like an indentured servant or something. And maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was he gave this woman to his son, although it doesn't clearly spell this out in the Bible. But a likely situation is if a man can't pay his debts, he doesn't have, the grain to pay back the lender, or the goats or the sheep to pay back the lender. And so he gives the lender his daughter instead. And so what Exodus 21:10 says is if he takes another wife to himself, this is the lender or the lender's son, he shall not diminish the first wife's food, clothing, or marital rights. And if he does, the law of Moses says, if he does not do these 3 things for her, she shall go out for nothing without the payment of money. Here's a Bible verse that says you can't just treat kind of a slave wife any way you want. Even she has basic standards. You can't decide that you're going to sort of demote her. You don't want to give her a wife's level of food. You don't want to give her a wife's level of clothing. You don't want to show her affection, sexual pleasure, that kind of thing. You just kind of want to use her. And the law of Moses says, nope, you have to let her go. And let her go is a euphemism for let her divorce, give her a certificate of divorce, and let her go find someone else who actually will treat her properly, who will meet these minimum standards. The next passage I want to talk about that also talks about another very low-ranking wife in Israelite society, and that would be a woman that you grabbed during a battle. Let's say that there's a big battle, the Israelites win, there's a bunch of dead people around, but there's also a group of maybe women who are tied up and kept captive. And you see one, you like one, and you say, oh, I'll take her. I think I'll have her as a slave wife, as a POW wife. And so here's what's really fascinating about that. God even cared about that slave wife, about that POW wife. And that's what's so amazing. When he took her, he had to let her mourn for her family for a whole month and show proper indication of mourning, cutting her hair, cutting her nails. Then he could go to her, which is a euphemism for sex. But after he had done that, Deuteronomy 21:11-14, if you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and are attracted to her, you may take her as your wife. After she's lived in your house and mourned her father and mother for a full month, then you may go to her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. If you're not pleased with her, let her go wherever she wishes. You must not sell her or treat her as a slave, since you have dishonored her. Again, protection of the lowest ranking POW wife. She can't be turned into a slave or a concubine. If you're not going to treat her at wife level, then you have to let her go, and let her go wherever she wishes, which means give her a certificate of divorce. If she wants to remarry another Israelite, she can. If she wants to go back to her home country, she can. But this is amazing to me.
Yeah.
That God has these minimum standards: material care, food, clothing, and then this marital right, which is a combination of things. It wasn't just merely sex. Of course, in Jewish society, their marital rape was completely forbidden. And in Jewish society, in the ancient rabbinic writings, the implication is that the women really actually do want sex, and they are very pro-sex, but they're just too inhibited to ask for it. So the man was taught to, be watchful, to look for signs when his wife is kind of, feeling in the mood, and that it had to be pleasurable to her. And we don't get that at all in our Christian teachings, because we haven't read the ancient rabbinic teachings surrounding these biblical passages. Also in the Old Testament, we have the teaching, if your wife is immoral, let her go, give her a certificate of divorce, send her out, and then she can immediately remarry. Now, I know that there are plenty of people who say that, no, if you were an adulterer, you got stoned to death immediately. That might have been true in some cases, but Deuteronomy 24 says you can send her away and she can remarry. And you can't remarry her after she's married, guy number 2. That's kind of an interesting issue. There were big rabbinic fights over you need to let her go, or you can let her go, give her a certificate of divorce, if there's been a matter of indecency. And most rabbis saw a matter of indecency as being something sexual. So that's how most people took it. Then we get into the time of Jesus. So the 2 big New Testament passages are Jesus saying that divorce is wrong unless it's adultery, and Paul saying divorce is acceptable in the case of abandonment by an unbeliever. But in Paul's writings, you can see reflections, hints of that Exodus 21:10-11, the food, clothing, marital rights. He talks about in Ephesians 5, love, nurture, care. And in 1 Corinthians 7, he talks about material provision and not depriving the woman of her sexual fulfillment. And we as Christians tend to look at that as a men demanding sex, but in Jewish thought, women really liked sex. And so you shouldn't deprive your wife either of sexual fulfillment. So those are the big passages that relate specifically to divorce, but many of us don't realize, we've forgotten the fact that there are several passages in Scripture that say that if a person is abusive, sexually immoral, swindling, on and on. We shouldn't even associate with them. We shouldn't even eat with them. I like to look at 1 Corinthians 5:11, where Paul says, actually, I wrote you not to associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister and is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or verbally abusive, a drunkard, or a swindler. So if a swindler is your financial abuse, drunkard, those are your addicts, drugs, alcohol, verbally abusive, idolater, greedy is also your deeply selfish people, sexual immorality, that covers, a pretty wide range of things. And yet these people claim to be brothers and sisters. So we keep being told, well, you can't, divorce your Christian spouse. Oh, yes, you can. Because this Bible verse says, not only you're not supposed to associate them, don't even eat with such people. And if God doesn't want them in our churches, how can he possibly ask a wife to have someone like this in her home, around her children? God doesn't even want these people in our churches. Let's take this more seriously. Here's another one, 2 Timothy 3:1-5. This is the NIV translation. Paul tells you that you're free to walk away from selfish, mean, out of control, or abusive people. Here's what he says. He says, but mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. They feel entitled to abuse you. So I'll keep going with Paul's list. Unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control. Okay, we were talking about these people who have, reckless disregard for people's safety. They're consistently irresponsible. They're brutal, not lovers of good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying its power, have nothing to do with such people. So in other words, here's another passage that's talking about a person who has a form of godliness. They attend church probably. They take the communion. They say all the right godly sounding words, but you don't look at their words. You look at their actions. Mm-hmm. And, Paul is saying, have nothing to do with them. Again, if God is telling us to throw such people out of our churches, how can he possibly be expecting a wife or a godly husband to put up with this level of betrayal? And all of this is based on these Old Testament scriptures of what's minimally required.
Wow. Thank you for clarifying all of that.
Yeah. You are very welcome. I mean, honestly, we could talk for ages.
That could be a podcast in itself.
Well, I was always told it was a gray area in the Bible. I was being abused for many, many years.
So,
not obviously.
It's absolutely not.
No,
it's absolutely not. It's really fascinating how Jewish courts dealt with this stuff back then. We have lots of ancient Jewish writings. Most Jewish women would have had some sort of dowry that was held in trust for her in case her husband died or unjustly divorced her. These were pots, or maybe if she comes from a wealthy family, her father would give her as part of her dowry some land. Or remember Caleb, the good spy, in the story of Joshua and Caleb being sent by Moses into the promised land, into Canaan. He gave his daughter an land and an oasis as part of her dowry. Anyway, these things were held in trust for her in case her husband died or unjustly divorced her. So what the Jewish courts would do is, if a man or a woman was emotionally abusive, they would, if it was the man who was abusive, they would fine him and he would have to add to the woman's dowry. If she was the bad guy, they would subtract from her dowry and give some of the things she brought into the marriage to the husband. Now, when it really got to the point of maliciousness, if he refuses to let her go out and go to religious festivals and things like that, if he demands that she stay at home, that's considered an infraction. That's considered emotional abuse. But if it actually got to the point of maliciousness, and there's some really interesting rabbinic writings about this, the husband could actually divorce her and keep her entire dowry. So there was these checks and balances. Courts hoped then that just by fining them, they could get the person to be a little bit more compliant and behave a little bit better. There's a really famous story from Puritan New England where a man basically told his excellent wife who had a very good reputation. This awful man said, I don't care if our fields burn. I won't go out there. I wouldn't rescue you. I don't care about you. Mm-hmm. And he had made multiple attempts to get her inheritance from her earlier husband. And what's really interesting is the Puritans fined him for emotional abuse. And by the way, the Puritans did allow divorce for, cruelty as well. And usually that was physical violence. We just don't look at the biblical background, what society was like back then, and how people in biblical times dealt with emotional abuse and physical abuse. And because we don't look, we don't see it.
Right. That makes sense. I mean, emotional abuse is, it's not something that's just a current thing.
Yeah. No, it has existed for millennia. So
you say that no-fault divorce is good because it's lowering the suicide rate for wives by 16%, domestic violence by 30%, and homicide rates for women murdered by intimates dropped 10%. But there are also some reasons that it's bad. You also say divorce rates are declining contrary to popular belief. In one survey, 50% over 40 said their reason for divorce was life-saving. Can you expound a little on that?
Right. Yeah, I'm going to get myself in so much trouble talking about no-fault divorce. But let me just be fair. And I'll tell you both the pros and cons of no-fault divorce, okay? As Christians, we really believe in family values, and the whole concept of no-fault divorce just sounds awful. So I'm going to give you the cons first. It does allow, a guy to run off with his secretary and dump his wife for no good reason. If you did that in biblical times, there'd be financial penalties to that. Now, with all states having an option of no-fault divorce and 1 in 3 states having no other option but no-fault divorce, it doesn't come up as much. Another con is that divorce is just tough and sometimes devastating to the financially dependent spouse and to the kids who kind of get discarded. Most of our states have the viewpoint that it is the ex-spouse's job, I'm going to use he, his fiduciary duty to support his wife and kids. It should not fall to the taxpayers to do that. And so they will hold the spouse's feet to the fire and insist upon spousal and child support in some cases. But it really depends. It's really a state by state situation. So I just want you to know that I do know that there are some really bad things about no-fault divorce. But let me talk about the good things about no-fault divorce. For anybody listening to us, if you are over 70, then you know this. If you're under 70 and you're listening to this, I think I'm going to give you a little historical perspective. It turns out prior to 1969, in most states, in order to get a divorce, you had to prove infidelity. You had to prove cruelty. You had to prove abandonment. You had to prove things to a judge. And let's say that you didn't have photographs of the bruises. Let's say that you didn't have photographs of your spouse kissing his little side chick. Let's say you didn't have evidence that he went to a hotel with her. Let's say that you don't have medical records of broken bones. Or maybe the judge just said, well, that's kind of a small bruise. The judge could actually say no prior to 1969 and send you right back to your abusive spouse. So you can well imagine that in order to get divorced back then, you were not only asking for a divorce, you were actually kind of asking for an entire criminal trial at the same time, right? So divorce is very expensive. You needed a lot of evidence, and they took a lot of time because it's basically a divorce case and a criminal trial, 2 in 1. So that means you've got a lot of people who really, really, really need to divorce, but they can't afford it. They can't get out, and they don't have enough evidence. And like, what evidence does emotional abuse leave? We all talk about he said, she said. In 1969, then governor of the state of California, Ronald Reagan, passed a key no-fault divorce law that went into effect in 1970. Boy, that opened the floodgates. And so the majority of states followed California's lead, and a lot of them passed no-fault divorce laws from 1970 to about 1984. Well, what does this mean? I mean, you know and I know what this is going to do. Our divorce rate in the United States, bam, hit the ceiling, hit the highest in our history in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Of course it did. We already know that half of divorces are for serious reasons, right? We already know there's a ton of infidelity, abuse. So this opened the floodgates and let all these poor, desperate people out, in addition to a bunch of jerks who didn't care about family values, who also dumped their wives. Okay. So there's some good news and bad news. That law went into effect actually as of December 31st of last year, 2020, that the divorce rate is now lower than it was in 1970 in the United States. And so and by the way, you're always going to get pushback from people saying, well, of course the divorce rate's lower, the marriage rate is lower. Yes, but this calculation that was released in the last couple of days, it is based on the number of married people. It's a percentage of married people. It's not a per capita. It's not a percentage of everybody in the United States. So the fact that fewer people are getting married, it doesn't affect this number. Anyway, so what no-fault divorce allows people to do is to get out before the marriage gets dangerous. They can see the signs. They want to get out now. They don't want to wait around until they have evidence.
Right.
No-fault divorce actually really saves a lot of lives. And what happened is all the family sociologists lined up. It's like, wow, we're going to see a divorce explosion. So they all lined up in 1970, the big names in family sociology, Dr. Judith Wallerstein, Dr. Mavis Hetherington, Paul Amato, Andrew Cherlin, all these big name family sociologists, they're all lining up to see what's going to happen over the next 50 years to kids of divorce, to parents who go through divorce, and to the crime rate. If we blow open the doors on divorce by doing no-fault divorce, what's going to be the effect on our society? So were watching like hawks. And what happened is by 2006, 36 years later, Harvard determined that the suicide rate for wives in those states, right? We're talking about the states that did adopt unilateral no-fault divorce laws. The suicide rate for wives dropped 8 to 16%. The domestic violence rate dropped by 30%. And the homicide rate for women murdered by intimates dropped 10%. I mean, that's unbelievable. We're talking thousands and thousands of people who are alive today, thanks to no-fault divorce, who would have been murdered. I get the worry that, we're, opening the floodgates, but the floodgates have closed again more than it was in 1970. And that's really significant. What that says to me, and I'm not a sociologist, I'm just a normal person who's a divorce recovery leader. But to me, that says there was a pent-up demand and now it's all gone back to normal. That's just my take on it. And I can give you all the data for this, all my footnotes, exact citations, exact quotes, page numbers, everything is in my book. I've got 220 footnotes in my book.
Let's go ahead and move on. The risk factors that contribute to ending up in a dangerous marriage are marrying young, fast, or early, having less education, being financially dependent, having low income, using biblical patriarchy to keep wives powerless, holding an overly legalistic view of sexual purity, formula thinking or prosperity gospel, or church peer pressure. Also talk about what can be done to make a dangerous marriage less likely. Can you briefly share about what can be done?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Centers for Disease Control, U.S. Census, they've stopped doing demographics on divorce. They stopped calculating it over 20 years ago. So the last really good, massive census-based study we have on divorce and what things correlate with divorce was done back in 2002. Marrying young is one of the top problems. People who marry young just have a much higher divorce rate. Having less education. This is a growing problem in the US today. It's a social issue. And I'm also speaking in averages, right? Because there are plenty of people who are poor and have low educations who have delightful marriages and faithful marriages and nurturing marriages. So I'm speaking only from averages, right? And then the whole biblical patriarchy idea where only the man has a say. When you have a situation where the young woman has no voice, she can't even indicate a preference. I interviewed women who said, well, I knew that my dad would pick the husband for me. So there was really no point in looking around or even dreaming of what I wanted to marry. A lot of these women I interviewed didn't even really feel that they had a veto. Once dad had picked him, the pressure was so high that they felt like they had to get married. And the flip side to that is they felt that having dad's approval or dad's blessing would somehow kind of almost magically guarantee that the marriage would be good. And of course, interview after interview, I'm finding that they married abusers. There was no guarantees there. Another issue is holding an overly legalistic view of sexual purity. I interviewed, I'll be honest with you, I learned so much from working on this book and from doing all the interviews. I knew that I needed to interview people from all across the United States, all different. Here I am, a white woman in coastal California. I knew I had to interview people from the South, from the Northwest. I had to interview people from the breadbasket, from the Plains states. I had to interview Black people, Latinos. I interviewed those crazy Canadians. I needed people from all over, Texas and Florida and Georgia and everything. And so what I found is, I'll be honest, I confess that I was really prejudiced against anybody who would have multiple divorces, like somebody who had married and divorced 4 times. Mm-hmm. But after interviewing people who had been raised, you're going to hell if you have sex outside of marriage, they would literally get married over their lunchtime because they felt that they were so sexually attracted to that person that they were in danger of sinning. And so they would literally go out and elope over lunch so that they didn't sin and dishonor their pastor, dishonor God, and dishonor their parents. When you're jumping into a marriage, and their intention was good, right? That's noble to want to be obedient, to want to follow the Lord. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's going to lead to multiple divorces and multiple marriages if you're going to hold that view that legalistically. So that's a problem too. And then church peer pressure. This is really a double-edged sword. There actually are studies that show that a couple that attends a church once a week or more is less likely to divorce. And so people have a tendency to say, well, that proves that if you're really a devout Christian, you're not going to be divorcing. Well, I run a private Facebook group of 2,000 people, and I would say 99% of those would say that they absolutely love the Lord. Mm-hmm. I did a survey and found that 6 in 10 were church leaders, either paid staff or pastors' wives or missionaries or lay leaders or volunteers. We're talking, these people were dedicated, and the pressure they felt not to get divorced was oppressive. Mm-hmm. So I really do believe that a lot of the reason that people who attend church a lot don't divorce, some of it is genuinely because they're surrounded by people who are trying to set a good example, but some of it is they're terrified to divorce because they're going to lose their position at church, and they don't want that. So they'd rather live in a toxic situation than have that happen to them. So that's a serious problem. But yeah, those are the risk factors that contribute to a dangerous marriage. And frankly, just being naive about formula thinking. I'm a classic example. I'm from the generation way before I Kissed Dating Goodbye came out, back then. And you ladies have had, long 20+ year marriages. I mean, I don't know about you, but I was looking forward to sex. And so I walked down that aisle as a radiant virgin bride in my white dress. I loved my husband. I was sexually attracted to him. I wanted this to be an amazing marriage. But everything my church promised me about doing the right things, which I did do, my husband to be asked for my hand in marriage. We did premarital counseling. We went through before I say I do Norm Wright workbook. I mean, we did everything right. I mean, I've got a Bible degree from Wheaton College. I loved going to church. I loved my Bible. I loved youth choir. I mean, I'm one of these kids who was just totally into Christianity. And when you believe the formula itself will keep you out of trouble, that is turning off your mind. That is turning off your brain. And what happens is I actually did see some red flags before my marriage, but the pastoral counselor just said, the love of Christ in you will help heal the hole in your fiance's heart. Your good, stable Christian background will be a good example to him. Or God plus you plus your fiance, you're both Christians. Therefore, God will fix your marriage. God will give you a great marriage. Well, none of those worked for me. I set the good example. I prayed. I tried harder. I was sexually eager. I was agreeable. I didn't nag. I mean, I can count the number of arguments we had on one hand. I did everything right. And doing everything right, the formulas didn't work. And the formulas still don't work. Now, are they good rules of thumb? Sure. But we always have to have wisdom, right? We have to have wisdom. Right. So, those are kind of the big things.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing on that.
To be continued. Stay tuned for next week's part 2 of the Life-Saving Divorce. You don't want to miss it.
Thanks for tuning in to Hanging On to Hope. Check out our website, hangingontohope.org. There are resources on there, and if you would like to donate or volunteer, you can do that through our website. We are a brand new nonprofit, so we appreciate any and all support. And we thank you for listening, and until next time, keep hanging on to hope. We are evidence that there is hope and healing for you, and our passion is to help you find it too. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening, everyone.